Hello and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week, believe it or not, we're finishing up the book of Acts. Did that fly by to anyone else? Yes, it probably did. We are reading Acts chapters 22 through 28, which brings us to the end of the book of Acts. Let's talk about this for a second because in our brains, in my brain at least, I want the book of Acts, to encapsulate everything we know about what the apostles and other good disciples were doing after Jesus' resurrection. Unfortunately, we just get a few little narrations here and there. Jesus's resurrection and crucifixion and resurrection, probably around 33, 34 AD. And the book of Acts carries on for about 30 years after that. But there was still stuff happening after the 30 years that we get covered in the book of Acts. In fact, Paul's life continues after the book of Acts. So basically, when we get to Acts 28 this week, you're going to be like, what happened next? It kind of ends on a cliffhanger. We don't get the rest of the details. Don't worry. I'll fill you in on what happens, and then almost the rest of this year, except for the last couple weeks in December, we'll be studying the book of Revelation from John. Most of the rest of this year, we're now going to be diving into the epistles, which are the letters that Paul wrote, and lots of other people wrote epistles too, and that will fill in a little bit of the gaps. Some of the epistles were written during the book of Acts that we have record of, but a lot were written after, and so we can piece together what happened after the book of Acts ended. So just want to fill you in. It's not going to feel like a satisfying ending here with the book of Acts when we get to 28, but we still get more of Paul. I love learning about Paul so much. And in the book of Acts, we get so much of his actions and where he went. And we've learned a lot from that. But boy, I can't wait for the next section as we dive into his teachings that we can find in the epistles that he wrote. So timeline-wise, let's kind of get this cleared up. So we ended last week with Paul getting put in prison in Jerusalem. He had gone to Jerusalem willingly, but then there's a group of traditional Jews there who were not very happy with Paul for many reasons, because he was such a great Christian and spreading the word everywhere. But also, I bet some of them knew him from 30 years prior when they're like, hey, you used to be one of us. You used to be a Pharisee. And here he is now, full-fledged Christian. He's caused a lot of issues. So they have thrown Paul into prison there. He's with the chief captain, who is the Roman presence. And right at the end, Paul had just convinced the chief captain to let him speak to these Jews. He wants permission to speak to them. So this is happening around the year 58. Okay. Paul is then going to be transferred to Caesarea in about the year 59, the following year. And we'll talk about that this week. He's imprisoned there for about 2 years. And eventually he gets taken as a prisoner on a ship to Rome, and lots of adventures along the way. But this ends up around the year 62. So that's about when the book of Acts ends, is the year 62. Luke is the author of the book of Acts, and it's assumed that he wrote this like probably the year 63, right after everything had just happened that he had learned about. He wrote this all down in the year 63. But Paul lived about 3 more years after this. He, after this, goes on one more mission trip, and he eventually is taken back. He eventually goes back to Rome, where he is ultimately martyred in around the year 66 AD. So, like I said, book of Acts cuts us off. There's still more of Paul's life. There's still more of the gospel being spread, but that's at least where we are. Hopefully that makes sense, fitting in context with what we've learned about. And then, like I said, as we go through each epistle, I'll bring you back in the timeline to where it fits to give you some context, or are we extending the timeline, how it all works. I like using my hands while I talk, in case you haven't noticed. Hope that's okay. There's a lot that happens, but let's dive into these chapters, because boy, are these dramatic chapters that show some of the character of Paul. Even though we do get a little bit of his teachings, he gives 2 really cool speeches in this section. We just get to see how he acted and responded in all sorts of situations. Paul is awesome. Paul is awesome, and we're going to love him even more as we dive into his words. So let's start with chapter 22. Paul has been given permission in Jerusalem by the chief captain there, the Roman captain, to speak to the Jews. And so this is his first speech that he gives, and he basically tells his conversion story. He's like, I used to totally persecute all the Christians. I used to be you guys. And then I saw Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. And then I have been spreading the gospel to Jews and Gentiles. We can spread the gospel to Gentiles. And he's talking about preaching and baptizing and all of these beautiful things that he's been able to do. After giving this speech, everyone seems kind of like, not sure what's going on. And the chief captain, the Roman captain, takes Paul to scourge him, which is torture, right? Which was just the next thing that they normally did. And at this point, Paul tells him that he is a Roman citizen. And immediately the chief captain says, oh, can't scourge you then. And he stops that in the process. So Paul is now making it known that he does have Roman citizenship, which gives him quite a few benefits when it comes to living in a Roman society. And at the end of that chapter, the chief captain takes Paul instead now to the chief priest of the Jews. He's kind of wanting to see what's going on when he speaks to this chief priest of the Jews. So in chapter 23, we now have Paul being brought before the chief priest to a guy named Ananias. It's a different Ananias than the other ones we've learned about. So new person, chief priest. Paul's trying to explain himself and talk about why he's there and what his goals are for being in Jerusalem. And Ananias is not having it. He has someone come and slap Paul across the face. And Paul then brings up the topic of resurrection, which the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagree on greatly. And it's almost like Paul knows this. And so he brings this up, and it causes this huge argument to break out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, to the point where the chief captain, seeing this all happen, has his guards take Paul out of the situation and bring him back. Like, hey, let's get you out of there. Let's keep you safe at this point. While Paul is now back imprisoned with the chief captain, the Lord Jesus Christ appears to Paul in prison, and he gives him hope. This beautiful, short interaction, but really, really powerful. Now, outside of the walls, there's a group of around 40 Jews that have just made a vow to not eat until Paul has been killed. But guess who overhears it? In a dramatic turn of events, Paul's nephew happens to be living there, and Paul's nephew overhears this plan. And eventually they tell the chief captain who's holding Paul, listen, there's like a huge vendetta out against Paul here. And the chief captain, he's not really on Paul's side, but he's not out to get Paul. I think from what I can infer, this guy just wants to do what's right, and he's not sure if Paul really is a big troublemaker or what he's really in trouble for. But he doesn't want mob rule to end Paul's life. He definitely doesn't want to turn him over to a group of angry Jews. And so he's avoiding that. And so he decides he's going to sneak Paul out of the city of Jerusalem by night and send him off to Caesarea. Okay, a different town, Caesarea, because in Caesarea is the governor Felix. So Paul gets snuck out of town. He's taken to Felix, the governor in Caesarea, along with a letter that kind of explains what's going on. And Felix accepts Paul and reads the letter. And same thing, Felix is not like, Paul, you're great, and not like, I'm out to get you, Paul. He's just kind of like, I need more information. You can stay here, imprisoned here, but I need to hear from your accusers before I make a decision. Okay, so chapter 24, we now get a whole bunch of accusers who they've now realized that Paul has been taken out of Jerusalem. They're not happy about that. So they all happily go to Caesarea to be witnesses as Paul's accuser, including Ananias, that chief high priest. He goes and tells all of the grievances that Paul has done against him. A huge group of elders, one of Tertullus, who is a famous orator. He's speaking very eloquently and explaining what Paul has done. And Paul goes up to defend himself and just says, I can't defend myself against these accusations because they're just not true. I'm not doing what they're saying that I'm doing. Felix, the governor, gets to the point where he's like, listen, we've got to wait for the chief captain. I need to wait and kind of see what's going on. So Paul gets put in prison, but he has a centurion guard who's with him, and he has some freedom to walk around with the centurion guard. And after about 3 days, Felix, the governor, invites Paul to come speak to him and his wife, Drusilla. So Paul comes to speak to Felix and Drusilla, and Paul begins to preach to them, and he teaches them about Jesus Christ. And as Paul is preaching, the governor Felix starts to get afraid because he realizes the power that Paul has when he's speaking, to the point where he's like, we might need to release him, but he's not sure what to do. And then ultimately, it gets a little confusing at the end of the chapter. Ultimately, Felix decides not to release Paul and keep him in prison because he's hoping that Paul will eventually bribe Felix to get himself out of prison. Felix is hoping he can get something out of this, and he's waiting for Paul to offer a bribe. That doesn't happen, by the way, okay? So Felix imprisons Paul for 2 years. 2 years, okay? Lots of stuff going on here. Let's move to chapter 25, because now at this point we have, Felix has been convinced to keep Paul in prison. We now have a new governor named Pontius Festus. Okay, so Festus is now the new governor, and there's a lot of pressure from the Jews to release Paul back to Jerusalem. Still, 2 years later, give us Paul back. We'll take care of him. And the Romans don't want that. They want to have their rule of law, whatever that looks like. And so Porcius Festus is trying to figure out what to do, and he gets to the point where he's like, you know what, maybe I will release him back to the Jews just so I can get rid of this nuisance and not have to deal with this anymore. And as he's trying to make this decision, Paul realizes this is now his last chance, and he uses his Roman citizenship to appeal to Caesar. He wants to be taken to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he had a right to appeal that. Now, Festus is saying, okay, now we've got to deal with this. And at that time, he invites other people to come help him. Someone named King Agrippa and his wife Bernice, they come into town, and Festus is kind of filling them in on what's going on. I need some advice. Here's what's been happening. I can't find anything wrong with him. And we go into chapter 26, and we have King Agrippa and Bernice and Festus there as well. And Paul is now given permission to speak to them. And Paul gives his second beautiful speech, and he bears his testimony. He tells his conversion story. He talks about what he has been through. He talks about seeing Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, and he bears witness that Jesus Christ is the promised Messiah. He is the Savior. And after this beautiful speech, King Agrippa so famously says that Paul has almost persuaded him to be a Christian. Almost, but not quite. After this powerful speech, though, Agrippa and Bernice and Festus kind of meet together. They're trying to figure out what to do, and they all agree Paul has not done anything to qualify, like being put to death or anything, but since he's appealed to Caesar, they've got to send him on to Caesar. So we pack our bags. In chapter 27, we are now going with Paul and other prisoners taken on a boat. They're going to go to Rome, which is where Paul has wanted to so desperately go for a long time. Here he is, making it in a very unconventional way. There's a centurion on board the boat named Julius, and Paul starts telling Julius that the boat is in trouble, and Julius does not believe him. And eventually there is a shipwreck, but Paul prophesies beforehand that everyone's lives will be saved. And it's true. Paul tells everyone, eat the last of the food. Okay, get off the boat, swim to shore. And everyone survives, even though the ship is completely wrecked, all 276 of them. And in our final chapter, Acts chapter 28, we start off on this shipwrecked island. It's the island of Melita. They end up being there for about 3 months. Paul is bitten by a venomous snake, but he doesn't feel any harm. Paul starts healing people on the island as well. And eventually they're able to make it back. Well, they make it to their final destination, their original destination of Rome. Paul is here. He is placed under house arrest, so he has a guard with him, but he tries to preach to as many people. He wants to reach out to the Jews and the Christians there in Rome, and they're asking, what do you believe? And Paul is preaching, and Paul ends up staying there for about 2 years, preaching to as many people as he can. And that's where it ends. That's where it ends. Like I said, Paul then goes on a fourth mission and ends up coming back to Rome, where he is eventually martyred about 3 to 4 years after this has ended. But that's where we end with the book of Acts. I think my personal focus question this week, I love King Agrippa's statement that Paul has almost persuaded him to be a Christian. And so this week I want to think about, what persuades me to keep my faith? Like, what are literally the evidences, the things in my life that persuade me to continue believing in Jesus Christ? And now how can I be anchored in them even more? All right, happy studying.